Hello and welcome to the podcast According to Sci-Faith, where we discuss topics revolving around the compatibility of science and faith. I'm Joshua Göcking and you're listening to According to Sci-Faith. Episode 61, Inflation. So, we're back. It took a while, so I think when the last podcast episode was put out, and when I put it out, I said, I plan to restart the podcast after a short break, a short Christmas break in January. So this short Christmas break was a little bit longer than expected, and only now I was able to record new episodes. And therefore, sorry about that, but there's even more to tell you. So now this March or April, it's about 5 years that I started this podcast, at least the German podcast. The English podcast started a little later, but here we all are already also at 3 seasons, so it's more than 3 years that this podcast has been going on. And of course, I'm always thinking about how should I proceed this project. As you see, it's also difficult for me to consistently report new episodes, especially because I have a lot of other things to do, and I also have a full-time job that I work on. So there's a lot of other things I have to do, and therefore I always think about how can I proceed with this podcast, which is the best way to do it, what do I want to talk about in the podcast, which topics do I want to cover. And more I got this feeling that that I want to proceed with this podcast or with podcasting in general in a different way, and therefore I more and more come to the conclusion that I would like to stop doing this kind of podcast, stop doing the According to Sci-Faith kind of podcast. So this will actually, the next 4 episodes will be the last official episodes of the Sci-Faith podcast or the According to Sci-Faith podcast. And afterwards, what will I do afterwards? So I plan on broadening the field of what I talk about in this podcast. So as you know, the podcast is called According to Sci-Faith, and therefore for me it was important to only talk about topics which fall into this category. So topics regarding science and faith, topics regarding these fields. In some cases, I might have deviated from that, but I really tried to deviate not too much from using the staying true to the topic which the podcast is named, because otherwise you would listen to something which you say, a podcast about science and faith, and then something completely different comes. So I don't think that is a good way to do it. But in the recent time, you may be have me heard spoken about it on podcasts already. Sometimes I have become more interested in other topics and other areas that also I would like to talk about. And this is especially in literature, in writing, in reading. So I'm a passionate reader, and as you have heard on the podcast several times, I'm also by now a passionate writer. I write not only the book Sci-Faith, the Compatibility of Science and Faith, which is a non-fiction book, but I also wrote some fiction books, from which at least one, so Alien Thoughts, is also available in English. So there's another passion that I go after, and I think this also connects to this whole According to Sci-Faith, but in a different way, because in According to Sci-Faith or Sci-Faith, the vision behind it is to really grasp the truth, so grasp the truth of science and of faith and combine it together. And I think science is always the attempt to grasp truth, to get to the truth of the matter, so to speak. And I think literature or novel writing, fiction, is also a way to do that, a way to try to get to truths that are not necessarily scientific, but truths that are more beyond that, metaphysical truths of faith, truths of life, truths of all this. And therefore to really do what I actually want to do, to really get in this way of grasping the truths of the world, of life, of everything, I think you have to include that. But this you cannot do if the podcast is called something like Sci-Faith, if this is the topic, because then you restrict yourself to basically only scientific and faith topics, and therefore I sense that it might be time to stop this kind of podcast and really do it in a new way, do it in another way. And this is what I intend to do. And therefore, these will be the last, as I said, it will be the last 4 official episodes on the podcast according to Sci-Faith. Then afterwards I will start a new podcast. In this podcast we will still talk a lot about scientific topics. We will talk about science. We will talk about how we can relate science to faith and how we can interpret science from a faith perspective. But we will also talk about a lot about other things. We will talk about literature, maybe many works, great works of art in literature, and also about other topics. And I also intend to talk more about my books, about the books I'm creating. I got some plans for this to include you in this process. So this is basically the plan, and also it will not only be in audio form, but as you know, there is a Substack that I maintain, where also some blog posts about science and faith are already published, and this I will also rename, and also I plan to every episode that I publish, there will be an article on the Substack where you can basically read it, and it will be like that you have an article to read, and in the podcast I will usually say what's in the article, but I will also expand on that in some places where I see fit. So usually it would be the case that if you listen to the podcast, you will get more content, more explanations probably, or more deeper insights. But on the other hand, if you read the article, you get it in short, precise form, without many airs that seem to come into this podcast sometimes. Sorry about that. But you will get both content. So if you are somebody who say, I don't really get to listening much or listen to podcasts much, then you can also read it or share it in a better way, or you can listen to the podcast still, and then you get even in some places deeper insights, more information, and so on. So this is the basic plan, how I intend to continue with the podcast. And I hope this is okay for you. I hope you like it this way. I will start just trying it this way anyway, so please bear with me in this. If you have feedback, if you have something where we say, maybe you can talk about these topics or that topics, what interests you, just in this kind of area where we are trying to grasp the truths of the world and of life, and also of faith, of course, and talk about these topics. If you say, hey, there's something that I really want you to talk about, then just let me know. Or if you have some kind of feedback, then or suggestions, then just let me know. You can use for this the contact form on my website. If you type in sci-faith.de/en and then /contact, you can contact me. You can fill out a contact form and contact me, and then I will surely read what you write to me, and I also try to answer it. So this is how we will continue. And now for the next 4 episodes, I will talk about scientific topics. One thing I want to say still, so if you are not sure yet if this new podcast would be something to you, that's not a problem. Just stay there, stay on the According to Sci-Faith podcast, which will still be maintained. So there will also be new episodes there. This will be episodes from the new podcast that are related to topics of science and faith. So they will, because the new podcast is in a broader way, these episodes will be less. So you will this According to Sci-Faith podcast will not be updated as often, but I think with this you will also get an insight to how this new podcast is and if it might be something for you. So now let's talk about inflation. So inflation is a term that gets thrown around, especially these days, but mostly in a different context than I want to talk about today. So mostly in these days, when you hear inflation, you immediately think of the economy. You think about the fact that, especially currently, the value of the money seems to be decreasing. So you need more money to buy, more money of more value to buy things that you could at earlier times buy for less money. So in other words, everything is getting more expensive. And the reason behind this is inflation. And I don't want to talk about all the economical effects that go into that, although this is also very interesting. But I want to talk about another kind of inflation that is in the term related to what is described by disinflation. So if we just look into economical inflation, then we see, for example, we see that there were cases where this went to the extreme. For example, in the 1920s in Germany, there was something like a hyperinflation, or that's what it's called, where the value of the money was so degraded that at some points, even to buy some bread, you needed 1 billion of the currency in Germany at that time, which was Reichsmark, so billions of Reichsmark just to buy bread. And this value was even more and more degrading, that even you said that people said, if you rob a bank, then it's actually not smart to take the money, but take the stuff which the money is in, so the buckets and so on, because they in the end will be of more value than the money itself. So this shows how this degrading of the value of money, how extreme this was in this hyperinflation in the 20s in Germany. And there are certain other examples in other societies, in other countries, where similar things were happening. And so what inflation basically describes in this economical sense is the degradation of money, of the value of money, due to economical effects. So basically due to the printing of a lot of money, which then degrades the value of the money. So what does this have to do with science? Well, in cosmology, so the science of our universe, basically how our universe came to be, how our universe is built up and so on, in this cosmology, there is also something called inflation, which is cosmological inflation. And there we do not talk about the degradation of the value of money, but since in the economical inflation, you have this case that the value, the money you have or have to pay vastly increases in a fast way in extreme cases of inflation. In this case, in the universe, you have an inflationary period where you assume that the universe was expanding in an inflationary manner, so inflationary fast. So it's a really huge expansion in a really minor time, in a fraction just of seconds, where the universe was inflating in a magnificent way. So just to get a picture of what is meant by this magnificent expansion of the universe. So in the first fractions of a second after the Big Bang, it is assumed that the visible universe went from the size of about a proton to the size of 10 centimeters diameter. And this is really, really a lot, especially if you consider that a proton is so small that not even our best microscopes have been able to resolve them. So it's a really, really huge difference in size and scale that occurred here, and this just in fractions of seconds. So this shows how huge this impact of inflation seems to have been. And what one also assumes there is that at this time, all the powers, all the forces that we know of, so we know of 4 forces. We know of the electromagnetic force, the force of gravity, the weak force, and the strong force. And especially the 3 forces of electromagnetic magnetism, the weak force and the strong force, one assumes that they have been combined to one force, one great unified force at this energy scale. So in this state of the universe, and these theories that assume this are called great unified theories, or for short GUT, and they describe it in this way because what you realize, I'm not sure if we had it on the English podcast, but on the German podcast for sure, but I also think we talked about it on the English podcast, because there is this effect of a running coupling. So as you know, forces are affecting each other by a coupling. So you can, for the coupling for the electromagnetic force, or of course, is the charge. So the particles are charged, and with these charges they exchange, and this is basically the coupling with which they interact with each other. And other forces also have their own kind of coupling, and these couplings have different strengths, different properties. But if you then go into the area of renormalization and so on, which is some mathematical technique in quantum field theory to get rid of terms to diverge into infinity, then you will realize that these terms, these couplings, are dependent on the energy scale where you observe it from. And this you can understand it, for example, for the electrical charge in this way, that you say, okay, an electron carries the electrical charge, and if I now get to higher energies, this means higher energies also means closer distances. So if I get closer to the electron, then the charge will change, because before the charge of the electron leads to other particles going around, be out of vacuum fluctuations being created and annihilated, and they kind of cover this electron, and therefore the charge decreases. But the closer I get there, the more I get behind those vacuum fluctuating particles that are shielding this electron, and therefore the charge changes. This is how you can physically interpret this effect, but basically it means that the couplings are changing depending on the energy scales that you are on. And then if you go to really, really, really high energies, then it seems that these couplings are getting closer and closer to each other. You need to have the right model to describe it. If you use the standard model, which is the accepted model for describing particle physics, but where we also know that there are some gaps in there still. But if you would use that, then the curves of these extrapolated curves of these couplings at this or this extrapolated graphs of these couplings at these higher and higher energy scales would not really meet each other directly. They would come close to each other, but then they would deviate away. But if you have, in certain theories, in these grand unified theories, you can achieve that at this GUT scale, there's a scale where all these couplings are of the same size, so where they all are basically one, and then all these forces are not different forces, but they are one force. So in this way, all the forces are different manifestations at different energy scales of the same source, or of one original force. So this is basically the idea, and the idea is that in this part of the inflationary expansion of the universe, that this has been present, that the forces were united in this one original force. And then you assume that there is a scalar field, like for example, the Higgs field. We talked about the Higgs mechanism on this podcast, which is basically a scalar field. is basically a field which to every point in a room assigns one number. So you can have, for example, a temperature field, which is the temperature in your room, and at every place in your room there will be one number which denotes the temperature at this place in the room. This would be a scalar field, and there will of course be different values. In some areas of your room it will be a little bit colder, in others it will be a little bit warmer, but basically it will remain pretty constant, and therefore you have a scalar field where you have at each point one value. There is a different kind of field, which is a vector field, where now let's assume you are in your room and you open up the windows, and it's deep winter, and you just open up the windows, and if it's a large room, then it will start there will be a temperature gradient. So it will start close to the windows, that there will be cooler temperatures, and this will not only be like individual values in this field, but this will spread out. This will have a direction, and therefore what it means to have a vector field is every point in space does not only get a number, does not only get a value, but also gets a direction in which this kind of flow is going. So in this case, if you have the windows open, in which flow does the change of temperature go, and this would be then an example for a vector field. And in particle physics, for each particles you have the same. You have vector particles, you have scalar particles, and the Higgs boson is a scalar particle. As you know, the Higgs boson is responsible for every particle receiving its own mass, and therefore you can see this is basically kind of the value that it gives every point in space. It's just a non-vanishing field value, a vacuum expectation value it's called, that's pointed to every point in space, and with the other particles coupling to this Higgs field, they receive by this their mass. And for the inflaton, which is the scalar particle that is responsible for inflation, is called. With this, you receive you assume a small a flat potential. So this means there is no, like the Higgs boson has this Mexican head potential where it changes depending on where you are located, and this for the inflaton you assume such a flat potential where this does not occur, where it's everywhere the same, and this also means this then yields to a negative pressure, which then leads to this inflationary expansion of the universe. And this is really a huge expansion and a fast expansion. So this expansion goes faster than the speed of light. And now you say, hey, that cannot be possible. Nothing can move faster than the speed of light. But actually it can, because the restriction that nothing can move faster than the speed of light is only for particles and parts of space, and this is due to the fact that causality needs to be restored, and if space itself is expanding in any way or form, this does not affect causality at all, and therefore space itself can expand in a way which is beyond the speed of light, is faster than the speed of light. So there you can see that this inflation assumes a high expansion or a fast expansion of space at a very short period of time. And the reason why we need this, so the reason why this is assumed to be the case is there are many reasons for that, and one reason is that the universe is assumed to be homogeneous and isotropic. So this means that the universe has the same shapes and forms, and in all directions it looks basically the same. So for this to work, the universe, or all the stars and galaxies, have to have interacted with each other, and this cannot occur when when the expansion of the universe is as slow as it was assumed before. But if it is the case that there is some inflationary period where this happened, then this can actually be the case. Also, there's the flatness problem. So as we know from general relativity, gravity is an effect of the curvature of space. So space itself is curved, which you can basically assume like you have a sheet and you expand it and hold it tight, and then you put things on this sheet, and then the even if you hold it tight, it will decrease, or there will be holes in it, and in around this the planets or things can move around like planets. So this is basically what's happening. So it's gravitational objects or heavy objects like the sun, like the earth and so on, they curve space, and therefore objects that move around these objects are put on a trajectory around them, and this is basically the effect of gravity. So in this sense, gravity is not actually a force, but it's something like a pseudo force, something like the Coriolis force, if you are familiar with that. So something like a force that isn't actually a force, but is an effect of something else. And this is the way gravity is described in general relativity. And this means that space needs to be curved for this to work, but one realizes that this curvature of space is really, really small. So it is there, of course, we have gravity, otherwise we would not have gravity if space would not have some curvature, but it is really, really small compared to what it could be, and therefore there is an exact and there needs to be an exact tuning of the density of matter and the kinetic energy. And this is not possible this would be needed for a normal expansion. It would be really needed to be fine-tuned, and if you have an inflationary expansion, this is not needed. So there it is even expected that something like this happens, and therefore this can also solve this problem. And there's also some issues like the density fluctuations in that lead for things like galaxies, or like bunches of galaxies, many galaxies at one place. This can only be explained this can easily be explained by fluctuations in the inflaton field. And also there are theories which include magnetic monopoles. However, these magnetic monopoles could not yet have been found, and this could be explained with inflation, because inflation would explain why they are so hard to find. So basically all these problems are fine-tuning problems. So basically what it says is our universe as we perceive it, as we see it, is or has too much order for it to have come into place like we have assumed before. And this is really interesting because it shows that there's too much order in the universe as the physical theories that we had up to now would expect. And this can, of course, also be interpreted as a sign, therefore, as a sign that the world indeed was created by a creator who put this order into the universe. And this, in the same way, also doesn't need to mean that there is no effect of inflation, or there has not been an effect of inflation, but it can be true at the same time, because if you have read my book Sci-Faith, the Compatibility of Science and Faith, then you know about this. There is this example that I bring. If you have, for example, someone playing Tetris, you know, the game Tetris, and you just watch somebody play this, but you don't know that there's a player behind it. So you just see these shapes flowing around, moving up and down, turning and so on. And then you see, okay, what's the goal of these shapes is to build a complete row and then to annihilate this row. And you see the end of the world is when this is not possible and they are all stacked up to the limit, and then this world is ended. This would be the apocalypse in this game. And then you start, because you don't know that there's a player behind it, you start to say, okay, there are certain shapes that seem to attract each other. There are certain shapes that seem to be attracted to certain areas, because the player wants to win, and therefore he will consistently act similarly to achieve the same result. But you don't know that there's a player behind it, so you assume that this is some natural laws that are behind this, and then you put all these natural laws in that describe all this, and then you get basically some physics of this Tetris game with which you can describe the whole behavior of the game. But still, in all this, there will be a player behind it who plays like that because he wants to play good, but not because he's bound to act like this. So he could at any place break all the natural laws of his behavior that you have set up, because he's a free human being, but still you would describe his behavior in these terms. And this, I think, is the same with the universe, with the world, that many things that we describe in nature are actually the working of God behind the scenes, basically, and us describing it is basically describing what God does in the background. So this is a way in which you can bring both things together without saying, physics does not understand this. This means God is actually behind it. Because if you would argue like this, then you would need to say every time when physics can explain something, you would need to say, okay, then God isn't behind it. That's nonsense. God is behind everything. So therefore, you with this example, you can understand how this can work together, and how things that are really well understood scientifically can still, or are still, with God's working behind them, and also how things we cannot understand, where we still can know, okay, even if we find a scientific theory that can perfectly describe these effects, this still does not mean that there isn't a God behind it. And I think even this effect of the seeming effect of inflation, that it yields the universe to be in more order than it is expected to be, shows that there is the working of God behind it, who created a perfect universe, perfect for us humans to live at, and fine-tuned it for life on this planet perfectly for us to live there. And at the same time, this can also be described by some mechanisms of inflation. So, having seen this, we need to also accept that inflation right now is not a verified theory. So there is no evidence for it, no direct evidence for it that you could say this theory is indeed confirmed. However, many scientists assume it just to be true, because many things can be only described, or up to now there's only the description of inflation, or it's the most prevalent description that we have of many of the effects that I also mentioned. So many are convinced that inflation is something that occurred in the beginning of the universe. However, there are up to now no direct evidences that this is indeed the case, and up to now this theory still is considered to be not confirmed. However, also some physicists criticize this theory exactly for that. They say this theory is impossible to disprove, impossible to falsify, and therefore it just has to be true because it cannot be falsified, basically. But this also is not of huge value in scientific theories, and has then the same value as some of the bad creationist theories or other bad pseudoscientific theories. So with this, I do not mean that all creationistic theories are necessarily bad. Therefore, I do not have enough knowledge of them, but there are some of them who are not really well thought out, and there are also other pseudoscientific scientific theories who are not well thought out, and this would put them on the same level, because they a theory that cannot be falsified can also not be verified, and therefore is not of any value at all. So there are also some alternative theories to describe this. One interesting alternative theory is the one of a variable speed of light, where you assume that the speed of light has not been constant throughout the era of the time of the universe, so that the speed of light, for example, could have been a lot faster in earlier times and slowed down up to now over these eons, over these huge time scales. What this also would mean, of course, is that time itself would not be always in the same speed, at the same speed. Then time would have moved differently in the past. Of course, the people there would not have recognized it as such. Time would pass for them like for us, because everything around them would pass like them, would pass in the same sense. But if one would compare it with us today, then one would see that time then was moving slower than it is moving today, or faster, depending on which what kind of variation in the light speed you would assume. And this is also interesting, because it could maybe explain why the time scales, for example, if you go after the Bible, if you look after the Bible, what the Bible uses as time scales, and if you look what the Big Bang Theory and the theories of the universe and of nature use as time scales, and these differences might be even resolved by such a theory. That's just speculation. It doesn't need necessarily to be this way, and it also doesn't, of course, mean that if the speed of light is proven to be a constant throughout all ages, the same throughout all ages, then this doesn't necessarily mean that this doesn't mean that faith and science cannot be combined because of this issue. No, there are plenty ways to interpret this and to unite this into one. But this is how inflation basically works. I hope you could understand the basic concepts of it. But I think the really interesting part of it is that it shows that our universe has more order than we would have expected without this inflationary theory. And this shows to me that really God created this universe who ordered everything perfectly for us to live on this in this world. So that's everything for today's episode. I hope you liked it and you enjoyed each part of it. If you want to get in touch with me or discuss a topic or want to give me some feedback, then feel free to contact me using the contact form on my website, sci-faith.de/en. And there you can go to the contact tab and contact me. And if you have any other things or episodes you want to have covered there, or topics you want to have covered, feel free to contact me there. Also, if you are not yet familiar with the format in which this podcast is produced, let me just briefly explain it to you. So there is always at the beginning of a month or of a block, there is a big block of 4 episodes in one thing. It's kind of like a preview, which I call it, where you have the next 4 episodes all in one episode together, combined. And this is for people who like to hear long format podcasts, who have a long way to work or something else, where they can listen to a long episode and can then have a preview of the next 4 episodes all at once, and are completely up to date from the beginning of the block. For those who like their episodes shorter, who prefer it if they have a half an hour or even less of a podcast episode, for those there is every week afterwards will appear a podcast episode almost in that length, and this way I can publish every week a new podcast every episode, and everyone can have it his own way, either once a month a long chunk of content, or once a week a shorter format podcast episode. So I think that's the best way for everyone, and also for me when I'm producing it. Please also note that this is an independent podcast, which means that it is recorded, produced, and marketed by me. So I really need your support in this. So if you like this podcast, then give it a 5-star rating. And if you have the time, even write a review to it. This just helps other listeners to become aware of this podcast, and then people who might be interested in this content can become aware of it. Also, if you have friends who you think would like this content, then recommend it to them and share it with them. Also, you can support me in other ways, for example by reading my blog and subscribing to my newsletter, or even by reading my books, which you can find on Amazon. For example, there is my latest novel out now is Alien Thoughts, which is pretty entertaining from the feedback that I gotten, and so it's also in some way related to science and faith. The topic of it is also in there, but of course you can also read the book to this podcast, Sci-Faith, The Compatibility of Science and Faith, which is also available in English since last year. Thank you for that, and now I wish you a wonderful day, and I'm looking forward for you to tune in again next time.